sit down. I'm going to let them give their opening statements and answer a question. So the question is, what does the climate funding gap mean to you? Because it can mean many different things. What does it mean for your organization? And do you see it as an opportunity or a challenge? I'll start with you now.
All right, thank you. I agree with you. This feels really weird. I expect half of you to start jigging around to a different set of music. But opportunity or challenge? I would say definitely I'm an optimist. It's both of them. I should introduce myself, Natalie Blyth, Global Head of the Commercial Bank Sustainability. And it's a huge opportunity. I was in this newly minted role 2 years ago. And since then, we know that climate tech that was required to reach net zero was 50%, that had yet to be commercialized. It's now 35%. So something is happening that's positive there. And we have a 3-lever strategy to tackle this enormous opportunity. Transition all our clients of today and tomorrow. That's from the large to the very smallest of tech startups. Because we're number one in trade finance and supply chains by a factor of 2, by the way, we therefore have a responsibility to change whole systems and ecosystems. And then the third lever, which is really critical, is to make sure that we pump support in, and that can be our network, but it can also be finance, into the new economy. 2 bookends, climate tech startups. That initiative's been accelerated by our acquisition of SVB, and now our launch of innovation, HSBC Innovation Bank. And then the other bookend is the project finance side. So huge opportunity, and we're right in there. We have got $1 billion to deploy into the sort of venture debt area, climate. We've got $100 million sort of partnership with Breakthrough Energy Catalyst. We've got an SME fund in the UK. We've got partnerships all over the place. Partnerships are absolutely critical as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Nazo.
Hi everyone. I co-manage a European fund for energy impact partners. We have about 4 billion of assets under management across a family of funds that invest in the very early stage. You heard from the Breakthrough before. We have a similar fund called Frontier, as well as growth capital for later stage. You can't hear me very well? Better? Sort of, not really. Okay.
Yeah.
See some nods. We focus on energy transition. Kind of at the core of everything we do is collaboration. And for us, this sector is very different from every other in that it really requires the asset owners. It's a material industry. The asset owners have to be part of that journey. And so the way we handle that is that we make sure that quite a few of the corporates that are in these sectors are investors in our funds and actively engaged in the companies that we end up investing in. We'll give you some examples of that later. Opportunity or challenge, both, clearly. It's a huge opportunity. I think it was 2.8, if I can use BNF, 2.8 trillion invested, 4.8 needed, so clearly a gap, but also a challenge because quite a few of our companies, especially at the very early stage, then face this massive gap of funding that's needed.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay? Yep. Run the Sustainable Infrastructure Division at Gresham House. We're a £8.5 billion UK-focused asset manager. I run our Sustainable Infrastructure Division, so what I look at and think about is that there's a lot of stuff that technology can fix. You know, I really like ChatGPT. I think all of those tools really help us be more productive. But fundamentally, late arrival. Fundamentally, we need to eat. We need to keep warm. We need physical products and services. And so I guess the funding gap that I see is that there's a big opportunity to actually fund the physical infrastructure that delivers the sort of impact that we need. There's big environmental and social problems that we face. And actually, I think trying to take a bit more of a holistic approach to these problems is what we need. There isn't really a silver bullet in climate. You know, COVID was kind of convenient in many respects, that people could just point at a jab and that fixed it. We need to take a much more holistic approach, and it requires us to take a multifaceted approach in terms of how we invest. So there's even social elements that potentially have an impact on environment. For example, if you looked at less developed countries, probably the single biggest thing you could do to help the climate gap is actually educate the women in the family. So, there's a lot of things you need to think about on a more holistic perspective. But, I also think that creates a massive opportunity. Like I think it's much bigger problem than a few $1 trillion. Like this is hundreds of trillions of dollars. And it's the biggest problem that we probably all face. And when you think about every good business on this planet, they became really good because they fixed a problem. And I think, when I think about it from that perspective, the environment is the biggest problem that we face, and therefore I think it also creates the best investment opportunity that I can see in this generation. And I think the sort of yield compression, or so the value appreciation that you've seen in things like infrastructure and renewables, you're going to see that in things that have more sustainability, more mainstream impact over the next couple of decades as well. So I see a big opportunity there, and I'm really excited about how we can do that. Apart from my day job, I'm also on staff at Cambridge Uni, so get involved in quite a lot of early stage companies. But yeah, I see it as a huge opportunity set, so really interested to hear your views and thoughts and questions later as well.
Excellent. Excuse me. Michael, want to say hi and introduce yourself and how you see the funding gap, yeah.
One of the advantages of being 6'5" is you can slip in discreetly to any place that you ever go to, especially when you're 10 minutes late. I do apologise profusely to everybody for that. You don't want to hear the tale of incompetence that led to it, but I'm really delighted to be here. Not least because A, the conference, and B, the subject within it are so important to what we do. So as the private equity and venture capital industry trade body in the United Kingdom, we're right at the kind of frontiers of all the debates around how we raise the capital for the great British and other ideas that are out there that will tackle some of the biggest issues of our time. And when it comes to the transition to net zero, when it comes to both finding the innovations that will power our direction to net zero and also helping us to rewire the whole of the mainstream UK economy to cope with net zero. Clearly, we're excited about the role that our private capital can play in all of that, not least because our model is all about active management of the investments that our member firms are overseeing. When it comes to the quantum of what's available, the blunt truth is that 80 to 90% of the capital that we raise for all purposes in the UK is raised internationally. And so our members are very skilled at going abroad and tapping into North American pension schemes, Asian sovereign wealth funds, private offices and the like. The frustrating thing has been getting it here in the UK. I think the Chancellor changed the terms of the debate on that nearly a year ago with the Mansion House speech, which basically got a commitment from some of the largest financial institutions in the UK to commit to put 5% of their funds under management towards unlisted equities by 2030. Now, that amounts to, depending on your estimates, somewhere between 50 and 70 billion pounds, which barely moves the needle on some respects, and that's assuming it was all directed at one thing. It will not be a surprise to people in this space to know that those in life sciences think they can spend all of that capital or deploy it themselves without any of the rest of you or us getting a look in. The point for all of us is we've got to change the nature of the way we supply capital in the UK so that at our end, where it's actively managed risk capital that's invested for the longer term, actually has a shout for this. But I don't doubt, it is unavoidable that if you look ahead to the biggest secular trends that we can do nothing about but need to embrace is the energy transition and the road to net zero on the one hand, and things like AI and what's that's going to do too. So in all those areas, I think this debate finds a very strong voice, but getting the capital remains work in progress.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining us. So let's begin the overall discussion with a show of hands, right? Everybody thinks about the what do you call it? The funding gap differently. Some people call it the Series B gap. Some people call it the Valley of Death. Some people call it the first of a kind gap. Show of hands, who sees, when you think about the funding gap, who sees it as a Series B gap? Anybody? That term is picking up popularity right now. Anybody for first of a kind challenges? Anybody else think of it as the Valley of Death? All right, I see a lot of not voters here. It's a big election year, so you got to vote. So, Peter, why don't we start with you? Can you describe the investment gap a bit more and why it seems to widen at certain points in development?
Yeah, look, I think I can only really speak in a qualified manner in respect to the UK. I think the UK is brilliant at raising super early money. So there's a great thing, the SEIS mechanism really raises money well for early stage innovations, really pioneering stuff. EIS is pretty good. So you've got probably 5 million quid there to go and get most platforms off the ground, which actually is amazing. And I think that is really, really brilliant for the UK system.
Billion with a B.
No, million.
Okay.
I wish it was 5 billion.
Yeah,
Then we
right.
wouldn't have a funding gap.
Right.
It is about 5 million, roughly, that people can get there with some R&D tax credits and other things. So call it, that's a pretty decent amount. The problem with climate tech is actually that it usually takes quite a lot more money to get these businesses off the ground. And then the other problem is that climate tech generally, a lot of early investors have been swamped by later capital, because normally you haven't been able to raise at following rounds at high enough valuations, such that early investors keep a decent skin in the game. So there's a big problem now from that 5 million kind of funding round up to probably 10, 20 million quid, because there's not really many people in between. So the traditional seed Series A investors are probably going up in check size and probably looking to go a little bit less risky, and they're probably not that keen on capital intensive stuff, which is more of what climate tech is about. So in my view, it's that sort of 5 to 10 million funding check that is the biggest gap at the moment. Once you can show a little bit more traction, you can show some actual product definition, you can probably get your prototype done within that 5 million quid envelope, such that your next check is actually the commercialization product. That is a lot more credible, and I think that's the biggest conundrum, I guess, for all climate investors now, is to how do you fit your funding into that 5 million quid, call it that, to get you to that next round. Because I think if you don't get to that next round at the right valuation, you really struggle.
All right, I think everybody's got to chime in on this one. I was on the bus this morning with my son. He was asking, about he's 12, and he was asking about this panel and what is the funding gap, right? And I was telling him, and he's like, oh, so first you need to build a really good company. And I was like, okay, all right, someone gets it. So that should be getting you past that, or to that 5 to 10 million mark. But Natalie, let's start with you. Like, what are the challenges that are facing early companies in getting to that point, building that good company and surviving the challenges? Maybe use the mic.
Can you hear me now? Great, okay. So you can see it on a graph and it looks like a valley, a very steep one actually. So the early stage, your R&D, your sort of lab work, your piloting, there's a lot of funding for that, small ticket sizes, a lot of equity goes in, and then the big, vast amount of money that's available with the commercial banks, private equity, etc., needs a commercially viable business. This first of a kind is the flex point that I feel that we're really talking about. And then there's this sort of gap because you need to have a proven commercial sort of opportunity. As you already said, huge high capex requirement, so the ticket sizes suddenly jump to something that's out of reach for those angels, early stage VCs, government support and grants, etc. And that's the bit that we've got to sort of, you can see government starting to come in to play there, but it's so tiny at the bottom. And then there's oodles and oodles of relatively cheap, non-dilutive capital available for that next stage, but cracking that first of the kind is critical. Nth of a kind, no problem.
We're gonna come back to the oodles of public financing available, the non-dilutive capital. I want to keep you for a second. If you can define bankability for us, because you're from a bank. Everybody in the audience, I'm guessing, is wondering, like we said, there's this dip. How does the bank fit in, and when can we come talk to you?
Well, thankfully, you can come and talk to us earlier and earlier because we've bought SVB in the UK. So we now have a proposition that when we set out on our strategy 2 years ago, I was a bit nervous because I thought, how do we sort of bridge this gap? I am still apprehensive because there's such a huge opportunity supply-demand mismatch. But we're pushing earlier. We're also, you've got to have the blended finance, so the corporates have got to tap into every possible source of debt and equity. And we've got a good venture debt proposition that's going now for a few years. And as I say, we've put another $1 billion ambition there, which can go a long way in a sort of early stage environment. But to crack through into the sort of regular flow of sort of commercial banking finance, you've got to have a proven commercial viable model that's scalable. We can help scale given our network, but those are the critical things: commercially viable, scalable business model. So that first of a kind is the real tipping point.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Nazo, Michael, I'm going to come to you in a second. Nazo, can you comment on that I understand you've done a lot of investment in software. Is it the same for software with this valley of death or funding gap as it is for project-based ventures? Or is it different?
Well, I was just about to say, I think there are two areas, and perhaps only two areas, where you don't have this funding gap. One of them is in software. If you have a climate software business, you are bound to get a very large multiple because you not only have the climate funds, but you also have every other fund looking to invest in it. The challenge, I think, the other place, by the way, is in private equity. I think the sector yet is not really mature yet, and so there are a handful of opportunities that are profitable, leverageable, etc. And so these are probably the quote, best places to be if you are managing these businesses. The challenge is everywhere else, right? And the challenge really is that I think it goes well beyond stages. It's that venture capital was really created in a way, if we don't go before the 1990s, for software and for technology. And so we have certain stages, and climate doesn't work in that way, right? We have to get venture to meet up with infrastructure. Infrastructure is very risk averse, and venture likes to take early stage risk. So we really need completely different forms of capital. And this is really a challenge, right? Because our investors think a certain way, and they have their own categories and buckets. And so this kind of famed blended capital has got to be part of the solution. So I think software, you're good. It's everywhere else where you have a gap.
Michael, would you agree with that? Thank you for that.
Can I just say my 11-year-old son was talking to me about whether or not Harry Kane would derail Real Madrid en route to the Champions League final this morning. We're clearly talking about the wrong things in our household. Look, can I just first of all pick up the point about what HSBC did with Silicon Valley Bank, which was very close to heroic, which I know is not what banks like to do, but there was a heroic element to it, but it was also a hugely important strategic element for the UK. I mean, as we talked over that weekend when it was collapsing about the significance, we said, look, this might not be a litmus moment for the British economy, but it could be for UK VC. And happily, the government really got that, and so did HSBC, and all the right bits were put together. But picking up the bank's attitudes to what is investable, bankable, and what others will put into the game is based on the same principles you grapple with every day. The risk profile of the investment, and when it's the equity being provided, that's bearing the heaviest risk. That's designed exactly what it's there for, and therefore, on the software point, it is still the case today, even in private equity, that the majority of what is being invested in is actually tech and software and things like that. And that's a great success story for the UK economy and globally. Where we get into capital projects and the kind of stuff we're talking about here, I totally agree at this point, the adjacency of infrastructure investment and then the businesses that you wish to develop or have developed that will take advantage of that infrastructure and build off the back of that has to be much, much closer. We need to make sure that they are sharing a goal as to where they're headed. But we cannot get past the reality. You need investors with a different type of risk appetite to put in those increasingly large sums of money at this. Now, bluntly, in the UK, that is something where our institutions have not been, if you pardon the term, geared up for that in the same way as US institutions. And our VC and private equity, although it's the largest hub of that capital anywhere in the world outside the US, it's not at the same scale. But that's where, just to quickly finish on the point I made earlier, the Mansion House Compact and the announcement made there, we've got to be realistic, it will take some time for that to come through. But it has really lit the debate up, and I think there's an understanding now that status quo ain't going to work.
That's very true. I liked what you said about increasingly large sets of capital. I was looking, my colleague Kim Zoe is giving a talk in a separate part of the conference. It's a big conference, right? Right now, and we put out a chart yesterday that lists out the investment in the UK over the past 4 years in climate tech. The biggest chunk was in energy. The biggest chunk in there was DERs, or distributed energy resources. Any guesses what that is? It's basically the chunked investment in Octopus. So it started off relatively small, then it got big, then big, then big, then huge, and all of a sudden we're asking, is this company still a startup, or is it just a regular corporate? Like, I don't know. I think that's a success story. My favorite success story so far, I think in climate tech, is probably Fervo Energy, this geothermal startup in the US that's proving out step by step a new technique for producing geothermal power. And it's been producing milestones, or getting milestones, and getting investment at every different stage of those milestones to go bigger and bigger. Now, before we end we're not going to end the panel on like, oh, and there's a bright note. Let's do it in the middle. Nazo, for you, I think you've mentioned when we chatted a few weeks ago about success stories in climate, right? Are there any that come to mind where the funding gap has been bridged?
Well, sure. I mean, there's some very large headline-grabbing ones, and I'd like to refer to one or two within our own portfolio companies.
Please do.
Part of it, really, I think, we mentioned before the de-risking some of this, and how do we de-risk this? And before large-scale infrastructure comes in, before perhaps even equity comes in, you do have the grants. But then how do you ensure that these first-of-a-kind facilities that can be built will actually have demand at the other end of it, right? You have no product, you have no revenue yet, so how do you do that? Our model is really to work with the corporates and to make sure the corporates are coming in and providing some of that. So one of the examples I would give is within our own portfolio is a company called Form Energy, which is a long-duration storage provider. So this is for companies that are producing renewables, but you need multi-day, not just several hours, but multi-day storage. These projects will not be launched until 25, 26. But through our investment and hopefully as a result of some of our introductions, now Xcel Energy, Southern Company are all customers, and they're building what look to be the first of a kind really of these projects to be deployed in 25, 26, right? So having that real access to the incumbents is critical. The one in Europe obviously is H2 Green Steel, right? If you look at that one, almost at every step, I'm sure it was not so smooth, but at every step they seem to have done that right. In terms of getting 250 million of innovation funding from the EU, in terms of working with the likes of Hitachi and Siemens. And in the Hitachi case, Hitachi put equity in there, Hitachi made sure that they bought their equipment and that there was really demand for their product once the factories are built, right? So, and on top of that, looking at not only the banks that were involved in this one, but making sure that Sweden itself backed up the loans for these banks. Again, de-risking, right? Making sure that the commercial lending is de-risked. And then on the back of that, I think it was something like 1.5 billion of equity from a number, by the way, we're not investors, but quite a few of the our LPs were investors in that. So you had the banks, you had the country that it was in, you had multinational organizations, the European Investment Bank involved, you had corporates involved, right? And then the role of the individual as well. There's a single person, Harold Mix, who has been really very instrumental in Sweden in getting not only H2 Green Steel, but also Northvolt involved, and the founders of Northvolt, so success begets success. And I think part of our challenge here is we don't have those really singular success stories in the UK yet. None of the top 10 were really UK successes.
They're coming, right? They're coming. Okay, just to let everybody know where we are in our journey together, I've got two more questions. We've reached that point where I could ask a million. I've got so many questions for everybody, but I'll ask two more quick ones, and then we'll start bringing in the audience questions. So if you have questions, please throw them into the QR code there. Peter, what really struck me about Nazo's comment there was about de-risking at every step, right? It's about execution, and she mentioned offtake, proving that you have an offtaker before you can get another round of investment. What are your preferred methods or things you want to see to de-risk a project or a company?
Yeah, so look, I think you need to then, Nazo was talking about first-of-kind products. We're actually trying to create a market from scratch. I think the way that we try to look at things is try to find a solution that everyone is actually already consuming today already. So give you one example, I think if you look at the food industry, that is massively ineffective for the planet. Like I think if you added up all the calories consumed by the cows on this planet, it's like 8.7 billion people's worth of calories. And they take up 45% of all of our habitable land on this planet, just from cows. So, you know, the food production is really inefficient. And so I guess we've thought, okay, how do you fundamentally readdress that? And we've started in vertical farming, and our first products are around leafy greens. Okay, leafy greens aren't going to save the world, but our next crops are going to be soy, wheat, rice, and pea. And that then is really going to start to get you off animal proteins and obviously carbohydrates and things like that. But, you know, in that case, if you can grow vertically farmed produce at or below the price of field-grown crop, you don't have a problem with working out demand. You know that people are going to buy it. And then you add on top the sustainability benefits. Like we're 1,900 times better from a carbon perspective. We're 250 times more land efficient. So our second farm sits on 4 acres of land. We can grow what it takes 1,000 acres to grow out in the field.
Oh, wow.
So that's massive land efficiency, 95% less water, no chemicals and pesticides. And then the other really cool thing is that because of the way it's grown and harvested, it lasts like 21 days longer. So massively reduced food waste, also much reduced packaging. Reduced packaging means less microplastics. Microplastics are causing infertility. So, you know, there's a lot of things that you need to kind of look at on a more holistic basis by tackling food at its source and starting with something that people are buying already. So I think I'm really up for, and you know, we are looking at alternative proteins, molecular proteins, but you know, the problem there is you're trying to create new demand.
Sure.
And unfortunately people are there's a lot of inertia, call it that, for people to change. But that's really where there's excitement, and hopefully that's where we can get people to eventually. But de-risking is really key, and I guess just to answer that question finally, de-risking at each stage. When we invested in that vertical farming business, Fisher Farms, in 2018, he'd been growing leafy greens in a shipping container. And from that, we used that to prove the growing data. We built Farm 1, which is 3,500 square meters. And you know, from that, we then proved all elements of the growing environment, automation, and then we built Farm 2, which is 7.5 times bigger. So, you know, just really prove it step by step, taking relatively small, calculated investments to start with, and then you can scale up. And then that's really, I think, the crossover point, because I think the biggest gap in funding now is exactly you described. It's kind of taking almost like venture stage investments, but with infra-like scale of capital to follow it. Because when I look at most of our other sort of peers in this area, they can't follow their capital all the way. And that's often when you get into trouble as an investor, if you can't follow it all the way to the end.
All about milestones, huh? Making sure you meet the expectations at each step of the way. I think it could also be about partnerships. I don't want to put any words in anybody's mouth, but grid tech is a huge topic right now in the US, right? Because of all this build out of demand, because of AI and et cetera, et cetera. Let's have another panel on that. But a big thing we keep hearing from investors and corporates in the space is that you're not going to survive as a startup in grid tech if you don't have a really solid, wonderful corporate partner to help you shepherd or allow you to put your technology on their grid, right? So Natalie, why don't we start with you, and anybody feel free to chime in about the importance of partnerships, how they work, how they can go wrong, what's a really good partnership, what's a really bad one. It's a lot of questions, but take a stab.
And you didn't give me the question on optimistic, sort of a good example.
How about a great example?
So on partnerships, I think it's not actually just for the small climate tech companies that need partnerships. I think people like HSBC, we're a big entity, we need partnerships as well. I think we will get probably 40% of the way to net zero on our own, 100% with a stream of partnerships. And those partnerships serve all types of our clients. So critical things for partnerships, though, for us, for climate tech companies alike, is that the partner is chosen very carefully, that you have got skin in the game. So in other words, we're sort of actually sort of got money at risk here. That you are really clear on whose roles and responsibilities are for what. No area for sort of misunderstanding that. And then the vision and the strategy, you have to be really aligned and quite honest with that. And that's the same with any kind of partnerships. The majority of our partnerships are designed to help the SMEs, which we know include climate tech, but they also include the vast majority of emissions in supply chains. They're the backbone of an awful lot of economies, and they're the ones who are really vulnerable to supply chain and policy shocks. They just don't have the bandwidth, the know-how, and the resource to navigate the net zero requirements. So on a supply chain, they can be sort of wake up one morning to find that they've been booted out by the buyer because they can't report on their carbon footprint, they can't report on their ESG scoring. So we've put tools in place and propositions in place with partners like Greenly on Carbon Calculator, EcoVadis on rating, and that rating we can then use for financing on sustainable improvement loans, even sustainable supply chain financing as well. So partnerships really critical. A good example of de-risking, back to the earlier question, I would like to just sort of reference LanzaTech and LanzaJet. So you've got a brand new sort of sustainable aviation fuel. They produce it from biomass into ethanol, etc. How did they de-risk? What leverage, what tools did they lever? So we talked about sort of offtake and so on, but also licenses are really critical, and they were really agile with the license. And they've got a real flexible opportunity for selling stuff that's not licensed to an airline. The airline will actually sort of help build the plant in the first place. So they're tapping into different ways of de-risking and accessing other people to sort of fund that sort of growth and high capex environment. So partnerships are really critical. We've done a great one with Google on the Google Cloud Ready Sustainable Platform. And that, again, is to sort of introduce them to us for financing and then also to our network for scaling. So partnerships comes in all shapes and sizes.
Is it a yay across the board for that one, or any further comments?
I'd say in terms of climate tech and grid tech, you can't do it without the grid. That's the biggest problem, I think, with a lot of startups and I see a lot of startups in the area, you're not going to get access to the grid. The grid operators have got this capital investment program that makes it quite protective, and they're going to want to do it themselves. And so it's sort of cutting a fine line as to whether you can really make those tech offerings work. So I'll just say, just be careful about how you think, or whether you think people are going to let you access. So good partners are really key.
Go find a partner.
Go get a partner. And that, if you're going to do grid tech, anything energy tech broadly, I'd say you need a partner, because you need someone to practice and show that it works.
Yeah.
If you can't prove it, you might as well forget it.
Heard it here first. If you can't prove it, you might as well forget it.
Maybe I can just pick up on the grid tech point. Again, one of the key reasons why EIP was formed was this notion that kind of this energy transition thing is happening, but the kingmaker in the middle are these energy firms, or the utilities. These are organizations that have not historically been known for being very fast moving. And yet, we need so much more, and where our demand on the grid is becoming so much more, and yet, there's kind of physical infrastructure there, and there's only so quickly that they can move. And quite a few companies have historically gone down because of the sales cycles. So I would absolutely agree, the closer you are to the grid, the more you do need those partnerships. And then their partnerships, I guess, which is the other point of your question is, how do you make sure that you feel like you have a partnership, an announcement has been made, and then nothing happens. It goes quiet, right? Right. Do you want me to talk a little bit about that?
Please.
Yes, okay. All right. I think the Hitachi example is a really good one, right? You have to just, first of all, make sure it strategically makes sense. There are some things that are really wonderful and headline grabbing, but it really has to make sense. The example I gave of Form Energy, where there's already 10 gigawatts of renewables, and they need to have long duration storage, just makes sense. That's the critical one, is at the core, does this partnership make sense? Second one is, again, kind of stating the obvious, the further it goes up to the top, the more important it is. So part of the way that we try to create these partnerships is that we try to speak to these large organizations at every level. Not at just the business level, but we really try to take it up to the executive level and establish the partnerships there. So that's really a key piece to it. And these things can take a very, very long time. And you just have to make sure you've got the financing and the patience and the wherewithal to really withstand all of that. Any other comments on the partnership side?
Michael, I got a separate question for you. Or we can keep going with partnerships. I'm happy to. It's the top voted question from the audience. What is the comparative advantage for the UK? So, you're with the BCVA, BVCA, I'm sorry.
BVCA.
We have the CTVC newsletter. People say CVTC, CCTV all the time. I get it. But what is the comparative advantage of the UK?
By the way, BVCA doesn't even describe the initials of the words that make up our formal name, but that's a separate internal matter. So I don't mind what order you put them in. Look, when it comes to this, I think you need to look at 4 key decision-making points. One is whether you're a UK-based allocator of capital, or in our case, mostly as I described before, a global allocator of capital. You want to know that there is a macro environment in the UK that is stable and trustworthy, and that's politics and economics, and dare I say it, without getting too political as a former politician, there have been a few bumps on that particular road in recent times, and it resonates. I was in Asia just a few weeks ago, and people are still talking about things that to you and I have finished being relevant a few years ago, but they remember the front page of The Economist where it was all about that issue a little while ago. We cannot take that macro stability point at it, because that has historically been one of our bits of competitive advantage, not least given this wonderful city that we are all in. I'm sure there are others like me for whom this is not where they live. I come down, as the accent might hint, from Scotland every week to work in London, go back home at the weekend. London is a great draw, not just within the UK but globally. Point 1. Point 2 is we have got, broadly speaking, and I'm more talking here about financial services than anything else, we've got our world-class regulatory standards, and to keep them competitive, we need to ensure that they are world-class, i.e. we're not diluting them, but we're not throttling people. Now that also goes then to the broader energy regulation piece and what's going on there, and we need to be able to sift out what's actually helping us substantively change the energy and the transition from the disclosure about everything you're doing to get there, and sometimes that debate is a bit complicated and unhelpful in making politicians and policymakers really get what will move the dial. But again, I think that regulatory standards piece is, I would say, generally speaking, much more of a strength than a weakness. The third thing is, and this is a slightly self-serving argument, but we can broaden it to the audience here today, you need an investment community that can actually apply this stuff. Now, this goes back to my point, but we're the largest hub of private capital expertise in the world outside the US. There's 140,000 people in the firms themselves or in the ecosystem that work on this all the time. We draw capital to the UK, which is deployed in the UK or elsewhere in Europe or North Africa or Middle East, whatever it might be. That is because we've got that credibility. That's another competitive advantage. The fourth bit, and this we can drill down into the transition point really very clearly, is predictable policy frameworks. Hands up who thinks the energy policy in the UK and energy transition broader policies have been predictable and consistent over the last 2, 5 or 10 years, or have confidence that in the next 2 or 5 or 10 years they will be. I think that is where we need to really pay attention to getting that right. Otherwise, that last bit runs the risk of undermining everything that went before, because you get the capital, which is well looked after and invested sensibly, but it's not invested here.
Follow-ons to that? Excellent, thank you.
The one thing I would say is, we get sort of down in the UK and in Europe, and we look at the US and we look at the IRA and the spend there. I think the one thing, at least within energy transition, is we have naturally competitive markets. Our energy markets are naturally competitive. If you look at the highs and lows of some of the alt energy providers, if you look at demand response, this is where really a lot of innovation has taken place, where it can take place because the utilities themselves are naturally competitive. So I think there are some real advantages to being in Europe and in the UK.
Let's pass this one around. Natalie? Peter?
I mean, for me, it's one, and it's absolutely right, it's policy certainty. And without that, it doesn't really matter what you do. You've got to have that confidence and the certainty on policy. We've talked about SMEs being the backbone of economies. They are the most vulnerable to those policy shocks.
Just quickly, it's probably the talent. Like I think actually the UK's got amazing people, and actually all of our businesses, no matter what you say about the tech, it's still fundamentally run by people. And I think the UK's got a great pool of people, really inventive, interesting, well-educated, and that's really probably the other key differentiator.
That's fantastic. I mean, case in point, we started a company and we chose to put it here because the talent pool is so deep. And I think Natalie's smiling because I worked with a bunch of people that she now works with that HSBC took because they're such talented people. That's a really testament to that. We're just going to go in order of voting. The second top voted question is, how do you manage expectations of both impact and commercial returns? I think, Nazo, we'll start with you on this one.
Well, I think it depends a little bit where you're investing. I think if you're really investing in, green technologies, they will naturally have both, right? They are, for every unit that you sell, you're going to have impact. So it depends a little bit of your investment strategy. I think most of the market today is about trying to do both. There are areas, pockets of capital that are discretionary returns, where the risk return profile may not quite be there. This is where you need that hybrid capital, etc. But the bulk of the market today, I think there is an expectation that fund managers, we will be delivering. So if you're in growth capital, you're expected to return growth capital type returns similar to another tech company. And certainly that's if we look at just the inherent growth in these sectors, we are seeing that. We're still young as a sector, we still need to prove ourselves, right? But to me, the two go hand in hand.
Can I just point on that? So I was at something yesterday, the whole point was of actually how do you measure and demonstrate impact, and it's very hard. And I think actually people have found it hard to demonstrate impact, often because they've not created impact. You're trying to create impact from like public strategies where they're not building something from scratch and therefore there's no additionality. So actually I think the biggest thing that we've got to do as an impact community is actually really highlight, you build this from scratch, you displace this much farmland, avoid this much farmland being used, avoid this much water being used, you avoid this much carbon being used. It should be pretty simple on the impact. And then actually I think the way that we should be looking at it is that impact can drive financial returns. Like that's the biggest thing now that I think we're just at the tipping point where in the past, if you were an impact fund, it was a dirty word. Like actually you had to sacrifice returns to create that impact, but I just don't think that's the case now. A lot of the businesses that we invest in, the reason that we think they're going to be successful is they've got a relative, it's like a monopolistic superpower, call it that. They've got a sustainability benefit that the other non-sustainable product doesn't have, so which are you going to buy? And when you can compete on price and then have sustainability as your trump card, that gives you that quasi-monopolistic kind of positioning in the market. And that's how we think about infrastructure-like characteristics out of a product with a sustainable impact.
I don't know about others, but my headphones are going on and off. I mean, I'm an optimist and I want this to happen, so I'm a bit biased, but I think we're moving in the direction of the triple bottom line. And I think value creation and reporting requirements are going to help us on impact. You can see that coming now. People, planet, profit. I mean, profit is obviously the one everybody's familiar with, but the rest of it is coming too. And I think value creation across 6 capitals, or the 6 capitals as well, I think is coming, and it can't be soon enough for me personally.
Excellent. Michael, I have a question for you, but let's keep it going. So, I can't let, I lied. I'm going to ask my own question, I'm sorry. I keep thinking about this life sciences question and the competition for capital. I also do want to go back to whether the European mode of carrots versus sticks for getting things to work, which is, I think, a huge distinction, but let's come back to that. Let's touch on this life sciences and competition for dollars or pounds in venture. So can you comment on that a bit further, that you have all these members that are competing for pounds, and a lot of them are going to life sciences. Life sciences wants all of it. How do climate companies or investors differentiate themselves for pounds?
The power of the argument is immediately in favor of what everybody here is trying to do, because you have to be particularly obtuse to be in denial about what lies in front of us and what already we need to do. But as we've seen, you might get one step ahead of it in an argument like that, but then there's so many other barriers around that. I think this is a macro version of the broad-based investment pitch process. Got to make the compelling argument. Not only this is the right thing to do, which not a person here today will be questioning, but also that it can, with the right blend of finance and different partnerships and all the right infrastructure in place, give you the risk-adjusted return, to return it to its basics, that you can get elsewhere. And that there is, back to the talent point, the pipeline of ideas and expertise around that. I mean, that's where the life sciences part of the UK, of course, look at our universities, look at the ecosystems around them, look at the way that the Golden Triangle has built out in recent times, although you don't have to talk long with any of my friends there for them to point out that we're still decades behind what's going on in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. So I'm afraid I don't have a magic answer to this. I do think we should look at this whole agenda though and say there is a lot of the basic arguments don't have to be made, but then the next set of quite critical investment assessments and so on do have to be gone through, and we just got to keep sharp on our game.
Excellent. One more question, I think, and this is from the audience, and it also was in the panel. Let's talk about non-dilutive capital really quick. You can pick it up, or you can pass it around, but there's questions about what is the role of philanthropy in all of this? Philanthropy, donated money, versus government funds, and how should companies or startups or investors think about operating or cooperating with that type of investment?
Right, this is probably going to be immediately obvious. This is well beyond my area of expertise, but I would make a very simple point around philanthropy, that the point, those who are driven to give at scale in that way are perhaps amongst the most committed on the planet about certain issues. And that partnership, to borrow the term again, between a committed philanthropist and somebody who needs some investment, from the earliest bits of research through to providing the capital that gets you past a particular gap in the funding spectrum, all of that is very, very useful. Bluntly, though, I don't think it's a help, and it's brilliant if you've got access to it, but ultimately, if this is going to be a mainstream success, you will have to get yourself back into the channels with all these other places, with all their inelegancies and shortcomings, which, the point, just a small microcosm of people on the panel today show there's a lot of commitment to addressing that, and this conference shows a lot of commitment to addressing the underlying challenges.
So you got to get in the game regardless. Any other comments on that?
I just think want to get non-dilutive capital, you're crazy. There's actually quite a lot of it out there. Go and enter some competitions, get some grants. Like, it is actually basically free money. And I think you're not doing your job well enough if you're not going to get it.
Again, you heard it here first. Okay, I think we're going to be conscious of time. We've got 5 minutes left, but I think let's close on one round across the panel of, if there's one thing you could fix or address, what would that be? We'll all stare at each other silently for a minute while you think of your answer. And anybody who's got something,
I'll start
first. Okay,
I'll start. So the global corporate bond, like the public bond market, it's about $180 trillion. We need all of that to point at what we're trying to do now. And that's kind of the single thing that I think we need to fix as a community, as a people that can actually go and resonate the impact that we're having. We need to find a way to reallocate that capital, because that's the biggest problem. Like, I sit in a lot of conversations with people, and it's all about, okay, we'll get 2% more of like the allocation, but it's 2%. Like, where's the 98% going of most of these big pension funds and allocators to the sorts of things that we invest in? Public credit is normally 50%, 50% of people's funds, maybe more. We need that. So I think the conversation should really be shifting to, I think Mansion House is great, I'm a believer in it, but we need more. So I guess my biggest thing is, let's fix the way that we allocate capital. And I think then the biggest thing that will drive that is a carbon tax.
Woo, that's 2 full panels worth of intel right there. Stay tuned, let's do those. Oh, please.
I'm happy to build on that. So for me, it is simply data and analytics. All decisions are increasingly made on better and better quality data, and we are so far off having that fixed in this area, and especially in banking. I'm not talking about reporting, I'm talking about decisions on allocating capital.
What is the biggest gap
Data
in
is
data?
critical.
What is your biggest gap in data?
It's the accuracy of data across multiple sectors, all sectors. So we need to fix that pretty quickly. And as we know, the way the climate is headed as well, we need a lot of data on physical risk, which I think the insurance companies are the advanced parties, but we need access to top quality data.
Amazing.
I don't have any grand ideas to add into the mix, but I've got a little kind of individual suggestion. If everybody in this audience, and all of us, and anybody we know, actually got in touch with the people with whom they are saving for their retirement, particularly if it's a DC scheme, and asked them how much of their funds under management they are allocating to anything other than the bond market or trackers, and said how much of it is actually going into this era-defining, era-changing area of the economy and society, and we get a bit of a groundswell bottom up. I think that is going to be key at some point, asking why isn't there more capital available and why isn't some of mine. This is not about all of it, or this is about diversification in returns. There's some great stuff here that we can promote, but not enough people are asking those questions of those who are making the decisions on their behalf.
Amazing.
All right, I'm going to end very tactically. In the same way as we try to bring, the most progressive of the corporates together so they're more likely to partner with entrepreneurs, what I'd love to see is other funds. If you look at an Andreessen has an army of folks that help the entrepreneur from pitching to fundraising to sales, etc., sales conversion. And in our sector, we have very particular skill needs. We have a lot of PhDs who don't know how to sell to a bank. So I'd love to have funds that really are there and have an army of folks that can really help the likes of you in the audience really be able to meet the next challenges.
Amazing.
The next stage fund.
Amazing. So we've heard that execution is important, along with partnerships, along with the UK having the competitive advantage of having the best talent. We've also heard that the gaps are data, the gaps are the bond market being pointed the wrong direction. We've heard so many great things from this panel, and I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking them for their time today and their wonderful insights. Thank you.